The dusty main street of Cedar Ridge stretched like a scar across the desert floor, flanked by weathered buildings that had seen better decades. At the far end, where the asphalt gave way to the dirt road, stood the Broken Wheel Saloon, a place where broken people came to drown their sorrows and sometimes found something unexpected instead. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days in Cedar Ridge, turning the usually dusty streets into rivers of mud that clung to everything like guilt. Sarah McKenna pressed her face against the grimy window of the Greyhound bus, watching the town materialize through the downpour like a fever dream. This wasn't where she'd planned to end up, but then again, nothing in her life had gone according to plan for the past 2 years. The bus wheezed to a stop outside Murphy's General Store, its brakes hissing like an angry snake. Sarah gathered her single duffel bag, everything she owned in the world fit into one worn canvas sack, and stepped down onto the wooden sidewalk. The overhang provided little protection from the relentless rain, and within seconds, her thin jacket was soaked through. "End of the line, miss," called the bus driver, a weathered man with kind eyes. "You sure this is where you want to be?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Where she wanted to be and where she needed to be were two entirely different things. The bus pulled away with a grinding of gears, leaving her alone on the empty street with nothing but the sound of rain drumming on tin roofs and the distant glow of neon bleeding through the storm. The Broken Wheel Saloon sat at the end of Main Street like a lighthouse in the darkness, its red neon sign flickering intermittently. Sarah had never been much of a drinker, but right now, the prospect of being anywhere warm and dry seemed like a gift from heaven. She pulled her jacket tighter and made her way down the muddy street, her sneakers squelching with each step. Saloon's heavy wooden door creaked as she pushed it open, releasing a cloud of warm air that smelled of whiskey, cigarettes, and something indefinably sad. The interior was dimly lit, with scattered tables occupied by local ranchers and drifters, all nursing their drinks in comfortable silence. A jukebox in the corner played something low and mournful that seemed to match the weather outside. The bar stood a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. She looked up as Sarah entered, taking in the soaked clothes and haunted expression with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen plenty of lost souls wash up on her shores. "Honey, you look like a drowned cat," the woman said, not unkindly. "Names?" "Betty Collins. I own this place. What can I get you?" Just ... "Coffee, if you have it," Sarah managed, sliding onto a bar stool. "And maybe a towel?" Betty reached under the bar and produced a clean dish towel, which Sarah accepted gratefully. As she dried her hair, she caught sight of herself in the mirror behind the bar. Dark circles under green eyes, cheekbones too sharp from not eating enough, brown hair hanging limp and lifeless. She looked like exactly what she was, someone running from something she could never outrun. "Coffee's fresh," Betty said, setting down a steaming mug. "Though something tells me you might need something stronger before the night's through." Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into her fingers. "I don't drink, didn't say you did. But life has a way of changing our rules, doesn't it?" Before Sarah could respond, the door opened again, bringing with it a gust of cold air and rain. She turned to see a tall figure silhouetted against the storm, shaking water from a dark cowboy hat before stepping inside. Even in the dim light, there was something commanding about his presence, the way he moved with deliberate purpose, the set of his broad shoulders, the weathered leather chaps that suggested long days in the saddle. He hung his hat on a peg by the door and ran a hand through dark hair that was going gray at the temples. When he turned toward the bar, Sarah found herself looking into the most intense blue eyes she'd ever seen. They were the kind of eyes that seemed to see straight through to the truth of things, no matter how well you tried to hide it. "Evening, Colt," Betty said with genuine warmth. "Rough night to be out riding." Cattle don't much care about the weather." The man replied, his voice carrying the hint of a drawl that spoke of years spent under open skies. "Whiskey neat." As Betty poured his drink, Colt Morrison Sarah caught his name from Betty's greeting, settled onto a bar stool 2 seats down from her, close enough that she could smell the rain on his clothes and the faint scent of leather and sage that seemed to cling to his skin. He didn't look at her directly, but she had the distinct impression that he was aware of every detail about her. "Presence passing through?" he asked after a long moment, his question directed at his whiskey glass, but clearly meant for her. "Something like that." Sarah's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. Colt nodded as if he understood the weight of those 3 words. Cedar Ridge has a way of holding on to folks longer than they expect. "Not me," Sarah said quickly. "I'm just waiting for the next bus. Next bus to Albuquerque doesn't run until Thursday," Betty chimed in helpfully. "That's 4 days from now." Sarah's heart sank. 4 days meant 4 nights, and she had maybe $30 to her name. She'd been so focused on getting as far away from Denver as possible that she hadn't thought past the immediate need to disappear. "There's a motel about a mile up the road," Colt said quietly. "Jenny Hartwell runs it. Decent woman, fair prices." "I appreciate that, but I'll be fine right here until the bus comes." Betty raised an eyebrow. "Honey, I close at 2 in the morning. You planning to sit in the rain for the next 96 hours? The reality of her situation crashed over Sarah like a cold wave. No money for a motel room, nowhere to go, and trapped in a town that felt like the edge of the world. She'd made so many bad decisions in the past 2 years that she'd lost count, but coming here running here might have been the worst one yet. "I'll figure something out," she said, but her voice cracked. Colt turned to look at her fully for the first time, those blue eyes taking in her wet clothes, the single duffel bag at her feet, and the barely controlled desperation she was trying so hard to hide. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but matter-of-fact. "The Lazy M Ranch has a bunkhouse. Hasn't been used in a while, but it's dry and warm. You're welcome to stay there until the bus comes." Sarah stared at him in shock. I can't accept that. I don't even know you." "Name's Colt Morrison. I own the Lazy M, been ran this land for 15 years. Betty here can vouch that I'm not a serial killer." He glanced at Betty, who nodded solemnly. "He's ornery as a rattlesnake sometimes, but harmless enough," Betty confirmed. "Good man to have in your corner when the chips are down." "I don't have any money to pay you," Sarah said, the admission burning her throat. "Didn't ask for any." "But why would you help a complete stranger?" Colt was quiet for a long moment, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. When he finally looked up, there was something in his eyes that spoke of old pain, carefully buried, but never quite forgotten. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be caught in a storm with nowhere to go." The simple honesty in his voice nearly undid her. Sarah had spent so long expecting the worst from people that genuine kindness felt foreign, almost suspicious. But looking at this weathered cowboy with his steady eyes and calloused hands, she sensed something she hadn't felt in months. Safety. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Betty urged gently. "Colt's got more room than he knows what to do with out there, and frankly, a little company might do you both some good." Outside, thunder rolled across the desert like the voice of some ancient god, and the rain continued its relentless assault on the tin roof. Sarah thought about her options, which were essentially non-existent, and then nodded slowly. "Okay, yes, thank you." Colt finished his whiskey and stood, reaching for his hat. "I'll bring the truck around. No sense in us both getting soaked again." As he headed for the door, Sarah called after him. "Mr. Morrison? Why are you really doing this?" He paused with his hand on the doorknob, his back still turned to her. "Maybe because someone did it for me once, when I needed it most." After he'd gone, Sarah sat in the warm cocoon of the saloon, listening to the storm rage outside and trying to process what had just happened. A stranger had offered her shelter without asking for anything in return, without even knowing her name. It was either the kindest gesture she'd ever encountered, or the setup for something much darker. "He's a good man," Betty said softly, as if reading her thoughts. "Been through his share of trouble, but it didn't make him bitter. Made him better." "What kind of trouble?" Betty hesitated, polishing a glass with more attention than it required. "Not my story to tell, honey. But I will say this: Colt Morrison knows what it's like to lose everything that matters. Maybe that's why he's got such a keen eye for folks who are hurting." Before Sarah could ask any more questions, headlights swept across the saloon's windows, and Colt's truck pulled up outside. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could see him waiting behind the wheel, engine running, windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm against the storm. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Go on," Betty urged. "And honey, whatever you're running from, maybe it's time to stop running and start healing." Sarah shouldered her duffel bag and headed for the door, Betty's words echoing in her mind. Healing seemed like an impossible concept. She'd been broken for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be whole. But as she stepped out into the storm and hurried toward Colt's truck, something inside her chest loosened just a fraction. The truck's interior was warm and smelled of leather and pine. Colt had the radio tuned to a country station that was playing something soft and instrumental. He didn't try to make conversation as they drove through the dark streets of Cedar Ridge, past the few scattered houses with their windows glowing yellow against the storm. Once they left the town behind, the landscape opened up into vast stretches of desert, punctuated by the occasional cluster of buildings or stand of cottonwood trees. Lightning illuminated the distant mountains in brief, stark detail before plunging them back into darkness. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that made Sarah feel both insignificant and strangely comforted. "How far is your ranch?" she asked, more to break the silence than from any real curiosity. "About 10 miles out. It's not much to look at in this weather, but come morning, you'll see why I love this place." The confidence in his voice suggested a man who had found his place in the world and made peace with it. Sarah envied him that certainty. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt at home anywhere. They drove in comfortable silence for another few miles before Colt spoke again. "You don't have to tell me your story, but if you want to talk, I'm a decent listener." Sarah stared out at the rain-soaked landscape, weighing her words. Part of her wanted to unburden herself to this stranger who'd shown her such unexpected kindness. But the larger part, the part that had kept her alive these past 2 years, whispered warnings about trust and consequences. "There's not much to tell," she said finally. "Just someone who made some bad choices and is trying to make better ones. Aren't we all?" Something in his tone suggested he spoke from experience, and Sarah found herself wondering what ghosts lived in Colt Morrison's past. But she didn't ask, and he didn't volunteer, and they spent the rest of the drive wrapped in the kind of silence that somehow felt more intimate than conversation. The lazy ranch materialized out of the darkness like something from a dream, a sprawling collection of buildings that seemed to grow naturally from the landscape. Even in the storm, Sarah could sense the place's inherent beauty. The way the main house sat nestled against a stand of ancient oaks, the graceful lines of the barn and outbuildings, the sense of permanence that came from generations of careful stewardship. Colt pulled up beside a small building set apart from the others. "This is the bunkhouse," he said, grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment. "Let me check that everything's in working order." He disappeared into the rain, and Sarah watched his flashlight beam dance through the windows as he moved around inside. A few minutes later, he emerged and jogged back to the truck. "Power's on, water's running, and there's wood for the fireplace if you want to take the chill off. Kitchen's stocked with basics: coffee, canned goods, bread. Help yourself to whatever you need. I don't know how to thank you. No need. Just get some rest." He paused, his hand on the door handle, I'll be up at the main house if you need anything. Don't be a stranger." Sarah gathered her bag and made a dash for the bunkhouse, Colt's flashlight beam guiding her way. The door was solid oak with a good lock, another small kindness that didn't go unnoticed. Inside, she found a space that was simple but comfortable, a bed with clean linens, a small kitchen area, a stone fireplace with kindling already laid, and windows that would offer spectacular views once the storm passed. She stood dripping in the doorway, overwhelmed by the quiet generosity of this place. For the first time in months, she felt truly safe. Not just physically protected, but emotionally sheltered in a way she'd forgotten was possible. As she moved to start a fire, Sarah caught sight of herself in a small mirror hanging by the door. She looked like hell, there was no denying that, but there was something different in her eyes. For the first time in longer than she could remember, there was a flicker of hope. Outside, the storm raged on, but here in this small sanctuary, provided by a stranger's kindness, Sarah McKenna began to believe that, maybe just maybe, she might survive. Whatever came next. Sarah woke to silence, so complete, it felt like stepping into another world. The storm had passed sometime during the night, leaving behind a crystalline morning that transformed the ranch into something magical. Through the bunkhouse windows she could see rolling hills painted in shades of gold and amber, with the distant mountains standing like ancient guardians against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. She'd slept better than she had in months, wrapped in blankets that smelled of lavender and sunshine. For the first time in 2 years, she'd awakened without the immediate spike of anxiety that usually accompanied consciousness. No wondering where she was. No calculating escape routes, no listening for footsteps in the hallway. The small kitchen held everything Colt had promised: fresh coffee, eggs, bread, and even a jar of homemade preserves with a faded label that read, "Betty's Strawberry, Summer 2019. Sarah found herself smiling as she prepared breakfast, a sensation so foreign it took her a moment to recognize it. Through the window above the sink, she could see Colt working in the main corral, his movements fluid and purposeful as he worked with a young sorrel mare. Even from a distance, there was something mesmerizing about the way he moved, no wasted motion, every gesture speaking of years spent understanding horses and their nature. The mare, initially skittish, seemed to calm under his patient guidance. Sarah poured herself a second cup of coffee and stepped onto the bunkhouse porch, breathing in air so clean it made her lungs ache. The world stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the occasional stand of cottonwoods or the geometric patterns of fence lines. It was overwhelming in its vastness, but also strangely comforting, as if there was room here for all the pain and mistakes a person could carry. "Morning," Colt called from across the yard. The sorrel mare had settled into a steady walk around the perimeter, her ears forward and relaxed. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in years," Sarah admitted. Surprised by her own honesty, he finished the session with the mare, giving her neck a gentle pat before leading her back to the barn. When he emerged a few minutes later, he'd shed his work gloves and was heading in her direction with that easy, unhurried stride that seemed to characterize everything he did. "Coffee smells good," he said as he approached the porch. "I made plenty. It's the least I can do. I'll take you up on that." Sarah went inside to pour another cup, acutely aware of Colt settling into one of the wooden chairs on the porch. When she returned, he was looking out over the landscape with the expression of a man who never tired of the view. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. 15 years, but my family's been on this land for 3 generations. My grandfather built the main house, my father expanded the operation, and I double quote." He paused, taking a sip of coffee. "I'm just trying to keep it all together." There was something in his tone, a weight that suggested the task wasn't always easy. Sarah found herself studying his profile, the strong jaw, the network of fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years in the sun, the silver threading through dark hair. He looked like a man who'd faced his share of storms and emerged scarred. But unbroken. It's beautiful, she said. Peaceful. Wasn't always peaceful for me. Took some time to find that. The admission hung between them, heavy with unspoken history. Sarah wanted to ask what he meant, but the morning felt too fragile to disturb with probing questions. Instead, she watched as a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals. With effortless grace. What about you? Colt asked after a while. Where's home? The question hit her like a physical blow. Home. She'd once thought home was a cramped apartment in Denver with Marcus, back when she'd believed his promises and overlooked the warning signs. Then it became a series of temporary shelters, motel rooms and friends' couches as she tried to escape the wreckage of that life. Now it was nowhere. I don't really have one, she said finally. Colt nodded, as if he understood exactly what that meant. Home's overrated anyway. It's the people that matter. What if you don't have those either? He turned to look at her then, those blue eyes serious and kind. Then you build new ones. Takes time, but it can be done. Before Sarah could respond, the sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted the moment. A dusty pickup truck was bouncing down the ranch road, kicking up a plume of dirt that hung in the still air. Colt stood, his expression shifting to something more guarded. That'll be my foreman, Jake Patterson. Good man, but he's got the subtlety of a freight train. The truck pulled up near the barn, and out climbed a wiry man in his 60s with a shock of white hair and the bow-legged gait of someone who'd spent his life on horseback. He spotted them on the porch and headed over with purpose, his weathered face creased in concern. Colt, we got a problem, Jake called as he approached. 3 heads of cattle are missing from the north pasture, and there's fresh tire tracks near the gate. Colt's jaw tightened. Rustlers? Looking that way. I called Sheriff Martinez, but you know how stretched thin they are. Might be days before they can get out here to investigate. Sarah watched the exchange with growing unease. The peaceful morning suddenly felt fragile, threatened by the intrusion of the outside world and its complications. She stood, preparing to retreat to the bunkhouse and give the men privacy to discuss their business. Sarah, Colt said, stopping her. This is Jake Patterson, my foreman. Jake, this is Sarah McKenna. She's staying in the bunkhouse for a few days. Jake tipped his hat politely, but Sarah could see the questions in his eyes, the same questions she'd been expecting since last night. What was her story? Why was she here? Could she be trusted? She was used to that scrutiny, but it still stung. Ma'am, Jake said simply. Pleasure to meet you. I should let you two handle this, Sarah said, gesturing toward the bunkhouse. No. Need to run off, Colt replied. We're just going to ride out and survey the damage, maybe follow those tire tracks and see where they lead. You want me to round up the boys? Jake asked. No point in spooking whoever's doing this. Better if. It's just the two of us for now. Sarah found herself speaking before she could think better of it. Is this kind of thing common around here? Both men looked at her with expressions of grim familiarity. It was Jake who answered. More common than it used to be. The economy's been tough on folks, and when people get desperate, they sometimes make poor choices. Cattle rustling's been making a comeback the past few years. 3 heads isn't much, Colt added. But if we don't address it now, it'll get worse. Word gets out that the Lazy M is an easy target, and will have bigger problems. Sarah nodded, understanding the logic even as her stomach knotted with anxiety. The safe bubble of the morning was dissolving, replaced by the familiar tension that came with conflict and uncertainty. She'd thought she'd left all that behind when she stepped off the bus in Cedar Ridge, but apparently trouble had a way of finding her wherever she went. I'll saddle up Ranger and Dusty, Jake said, already heading toward the barn. Give me 10 minutes. After he'd gone, Colt turned back to Sarah with an apologetic expression. I'm sorry about this. Not exactly the quiet morning I'd promised. It's your ranch, Sarah said. Your responsibility. I understand. I should be back by early afternoon. There's plenty of food in the kitchen, and you're welcome to explore the place if you want. Just stay clear of the north pasture until we figure out what's going on." The warning sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She'd spent the last 2 years looking over her shoulder, and the thought that she might have brought danger to this peaceful place was almost unbearable. What if Marcus had somehow tracked her here? What if the missing cattle were connected to her presence? "Colt," she said, catching his arm as he started to leave. "What if this has something to do with me?" He stopped, studying her face with those penetrating blue eyes. "Why would you think that? I told you I was running from something. Maybe I brought trouble with me." "Cattle rustling's been a problem in these parts since before you were born," he said gently. "This isn't about you, Sarah. Sometimes bad things just happen, and we deal with them as they come." His certainty was reassuring, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was a magnet for chaos, that wherever she went, destruction followed. She'd seen it happen too many times to dismiss it as coincidence. Jake emerged from the barn leading 2 saddled horses, their coats gleaming in the morning sun. Both animals were clearly well cared for and eager to work, dancing slightly as they anticipated the ride ahead. "Ready when you are," Jake called. Colt squeezed Sarah's shoulder gently. "Try not to worry. We'll handle this." She watched them ride out toward the northern edge of the property, their figures growing smaller against the vast backdrop of the ranch. The sight filled her with an unexpected longing, not just for their return, but for the kind of life they represented: roots, purpose, the ability to fight for what mattered instead of always running away. Alone again, Sarah found herself walking the perimeter of the immediate ranch buildings, taking inventory of this place that had offered her sanctuary. The main house was a sprawling adobe structure with deep porches and climbing roses that would be spectacular when they bloomed. The barn was solid and well-maintained, housing what looked like a dozen horses and equipped with everything needed to care for them properly. Behind the barn, she discovered a vegetable garden that showed signs of careful tending. Neat rows of what looked like tomatoes, peppers, and herbs, all protected by a fence designed to keep out rabbits and deer. Someone had invested considerable time and love in this place, and it showed in every detail. As she explored, Sarah found herself thinking about Colt's words, "Then you build new ones." It takes time, but it can be done. The idea of building anything, relationships, a home, a future, felt impossibly foreign. She'd spent so long focused on survival that the concept of actually living seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. But standing here in this place, surrounded by the evidence of someone's determination to create something lasting and beautiful, she began to wonder if maybe she'd been thinking about it all wrong. Maybe survival wasn't the end goal. Maybe it was just the beginning. The sound of another approaching vehicle interrupted her thoughts. This time it was a sheriff's cruiser, moving fast enough to send up its own dust cloud. Sarah's heart rate spiked as the car pulled up near the main house, and a uniformed officer stepped out. A middle-aged Hispanic woman with the bearing of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. Sheriff Martinez, Sarah realized. Jake had called her about the missing cattle, but her arrival so soon after the men had ridden out felt ominous. The officer looked around, spotted Sarah near the garden, and headed in her direction. "Morning," Sheriff Martinez said, her tone professional but not unfriendly. "I'm looking for Colt Morrison. His foreman called about some missing livestock." "He's out checking the north pasture with Jake," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "They left about an hour ago." "And you are?" "Sarah McKenna. I'm staying in the bunkhouse temporarily." The sheriff's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught the slight shift in her posture, the subtle tension that suggested she was now being evaluated as more than just a source of information. It was a familiar feeling, and one that never failed to make her skin crawl. "How long have you been here, Miss McKenna?" "Since last night." The bus broke down in town, and Mr. Morrison offered me a place to stay until the next one comes through." Sheriff Martinez nodded slowly, and Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling that every word was being cataloged and analyzed. "Where were you traveling from?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Sarah knew she had to answer. Refusing would only make her look more suspicious, but the truth felt too dangerous to share with a law enforcement officer who's already looking at her with barely concealed skepticism. "Denver," she said finally, which was technically true even if it wasn't the complete story. "Long way to travel just to catch another bus. Sometimes you need to get as far away as possible from where you started." The honesty in her answer seemed to surprise the sheriff, who studied her with new interest. Running from something specific? Or just running? Sarah felt the familiar weight of her secrets pressing down on her chest. How could she explain that she was running from a man who'd promised to kill her if she ever tried to leave him? That she'd spent 2 years living under assumed names and sleeping with one eye open? That she'd finally found something that felt like safety, only to worry that her presence might bring danger to the people who'd shown her kindness? "Just running," she said, which was both the truth and a lie. Sheriff Martinez seemed to accept this answer, or at least decided not to push further. "Well, you picked an interesting time to land in Cedar Ridge. We've had some unusual activity in the area lately, not just missing livestock, but reports of strangers asking questions around town, vehicles that don't belong. Have you noticed anything unusual since you've been here?" The question sent ice water through Sarah's veins. Strangers asking questions. The very thing she'd been dreading since she'd stepped off that bus. What kind of questions? About newcomers mostly. People looking for someone who fits your general description, young woman. Traveling alone, might be using a different name. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Sarah gripped the fence post beside her to keep from falling, her mind racing through the possibilities. It could be Marcus finally tracking her down after all this time. It could be the police from Denver, following up on the charges she'd never been able to prove. Or it could be something else entirely, some new threat she hadn't even considered. "Miss McKenna, are you all right?" Sarah realized she'd gone silent for too long, and Sheriff Martinez was watching her with the sharp attention of someone trained to read guilt and fear. She forced herself to meet the woman's eyes, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. "I'm fine, just tired. Maybe you should sit down for a minute. You look pretty shaken." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the return of Colt and Jake. Both men were riding hard, their faces grim with whatever they'd discovered in the north pasture. They pulled up near the sheriff's car, and Colt swung down from his saddle with the fluid grace of someone who'd been born to the movement. "Sheriff Martinez," he said, tipping his hat. "Appreciate you coming out so quickly. What did you find?" "Professional job," Jake answered, dismounting from his own horse. "Clean cuts on the fence, tire tracks from a heavy trailer, no evidence left behind. These weren't amateurs. Any idea which direction they headed?" "Tracks lead to the county road, but they could have gone anywhere from there," Colt said. His gaze found Sarah, and she saw concern flicker in his eyes at her obvious distress. "Sheriff, is everything all right?" Sheriff Martinez glanced between them, and Sarah could see her making calculations, weighing what she knew against what she suspected, trying to determine if there was a connection between the missing cattle and the frightened woman standing in the garden. "I was just telling Ms. McKenna about some unusual activity we've been tracking. People asking questions around town, looking for someone." The sheriff's eyes never left Sarah's face. Thought she should be aware for her own safety. The words hit Colt like a physical blow. Sarah watched his expression change from concern to understanding to something harder and more protective. He moved closer to her, not touching but making. His presence felt as a shield between her and whatever threat the sheriff represented. "What kind of people?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "The kind that makes folks nervous when they start asking questions. Professional, well-dressed, carrying pictures and offering money for information. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. It was worse than she'd imagined, not just Marcus looking for her, but people with resources and connections. The kind of people who didn't give up easily. "How long have they been around?" Colt asked. "First reports came in 3 days ago. The same day your guest arrived in town." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Sarah saw understanding dawn in Jake's weathered features, watched him piece together the timeline, and draw his own conclusions. She wanted to run, to grab her duffel bag and disappear before she could bring any more trouble to these good people who'd shown her kindness. "I should go," she said quietly. "I should have never come here." "You're not going anywhere," Colt said firmly. "Not until we figure out exactly what's going on." Sheriff Martinez looked between them with the expression of someone who'd seen this particular drama play out too many times. "Ms. McKenna, if there's something you want to tell me, something that might help me understand why people are looking for you, now would be a good time." Sarah stared at the ground, feeling the weight of 3 pairs of eyes watching her, waiting for an explanation she wasn't sure she could give. The truth was too complicated, too dangerous, and too shameful to share with strangers. But the lies were becoming harder to maintain, and she was tired, so very tired of carrying the burden alone. "I can't," she whispered. "I'm sorry, but I can't." The sheriff sighed, a sound that spoke of long experience with frightened people and incomplete stories. "Well then, I suppose we'll just have to keep our eyes open and see what develops." As she walked back to her cruiser, Sarah felt the last of her fragile peace crumble away. The storm had passed, but another one was coming, one that threatened not just her safety, but the safety of everyone she'd begun to care about. And this time, she wasn't sure there would be anywhere left to run. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah sat on the bunkhouse steps, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. 3 hours had passed since Sheriff Martinez left, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the storm clouds that had rolled through the night before. Colt and Jake had returned to their work, but she could feel their watchful presence, even when they were out of sight. Every sound made her jump: the creak of a gate, the lowing of cattle, the distant rumble of an engine on the county road. She'd lived this way for 2 years, always listening, always waiting for the footsteps that meant her time was up. But here, in this place that had felt like sanctuary just hours before, the hypervigilance felt like a betrayal of the peace she'd been offered. Jake emerged from the barn carrying a coil of rope, his weathered face creased with the kind of concern that came from decades of watching over both livestock and people. He approached slowly, the way she'd seen him move around skittish horses, his movements telegraphed and non-threatening. "Mind if I sit a spell?" he asked, nodding toward the other step. Sarah gestured for him to join her, grateful for the company, even as she dreaded the questions that were sure to come. Jake settled beside her with a grunt, pulling off his hat to wipe the sweat from his forehead. "Been working this ranch for 8 years now," he said without preamble. "Seen Colt through some of his darkest times, and he's seen me through mine. That's what we do out here. We look after each other." Sarah waited, knowing there was more coming. The thing is, when someone's in trouble, really in trouble, it has a way of spreading to everyone around them. Like a grass fire in August starts. Small, but if you don't handle it right, it can burn down everything that matters. The words stung because they echoed her own fears. "You think I should leave? I think you should trust us with the truth. All of it." Jake's voice was kind but firm, carrying the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak plainly. Sarah studied his face, the deep lines carved by years of squinting into the sun, the honest eyes that had seen their share of hardship, the set of his jaw that spoke of a man who didn't back down when something mattered. "It's complicated," she said finally. "Most things worth doing are." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of an approaching vehicle cut through the afternoon quiet. This time it wasn't the sheriff's cruiser or any vehicle she recognized. A black SUV with tinted windows was making its way down the ranch road, moving with the kind of purpose that made her blood run cold. Jake was on his feet instantly, his hand moving instinctively to the radio clipped to his belt. "Colt, we got company," he said into the device. Black SUV, Colorado plates, heading for the main house. The radio crackled back immediately. "On my way." Sarah felt her world tilt sideways. Colorado plates. After 2 years of running, after traveling thousands of miles and sleeping in dozens of different beds, they'd found her. She stood on unsteady legs, her mind already calculating escape routes, the back door of the bunkhouse, the trees beyond the corral, the maze of arroyos that cut through the desert. "Sarah." Jake's voice was calm but commanding. "Stay put. Don't run. You don't understand," she whispered, watching the SUV pull up near the main house. "You don't know what they're capable of." 2 men emerged from the vehicle, and even at a distance, Sarah could see they weren't local law enforcement. They wore expensive suits despite the heat, moved with the controlled grace of professionals, and carried themselves with the kind of confidence that came from knowing they held all the cards. The driver was tall and lean with prematurely gray hair, while his passenger was built like a linebacker and wore sunglasses despite the fact that they were standing in the shadow of the house. "Who are they?" Jake asked quietly. "Marcus's people." The admission felt like swallowing broken glass. "Private investigators may be worse. They've been looking for me for 2 years. And this Marcus, he's the reason you're running?" Sarah nodded, unable to trust her voice. Saying his name out loud felt like invoking a demon, calling down the very darkness she'd been trying to escape. Colt appeared around the corner of the barn, moving with the deceptive calm of a man who'd faced down his share of trouble. He approached the SUV with his hands visible but not raised, his posture projecting both confidence and caution. Sarah couldn't hear the conversation from this distance, but she could read the body language. Investigators showing photographs, Colt shaking his head. The gradual escalation of tension as they pressed their questions. "We need to get you out of sight," Jake said, taking her arm gently but firmly. "Bunkhouse has good sight lines, and there's a back way out if things go sideways." "I won't bring this down on you," Sarah protested, even as she allowed him to guide her toward the building. "These aren't the kind of people you can reason with. Neither are we when it comes to protecting our own." A simple declaration hit her like a physical blow. Our own. When was the last time someone had considered her part of anything worth protecting? She wanted to tell Jake that he was wrong, that she wasn't worth the risk, but the words died in her throat as she watched Colt continue his careful dance with the 2 men. Inside the bunkhouse, Jake positioned himself by the window with the best view of the confrontation, his radio in one hand and what Sarah now realized was a pistol in the other. The casual way he handled the weapon suggested long familiarity with its use. "What's happening?" Sarah asked, afraid to look but unable to turn away. "Colt's playing dumb, telling them he hasn't seen anyone matching your description. They're showing him pictures, probably offering money for information. He should just tell them where I am. It would be easier for everyone." Jake turned to look at her with an expression of genuine surprise. "You really think that's the kind of man he is?" Before Sarah could answer, the radio crackled to life. "Jake, they're asking to search the property. I'm telling them they need a warrant, but they're not looking like the type to be deterred by legal niceties. Copy that. We're secure here." Through the window, Sarah watched as the conversation grew more heated. The larger man was gesturing toward the outbuildings, his body language becoming increasingly aggressive. Colt stood his ground, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight shift in his stance that suggested he was preparing for the situation to turn physical. "This is my fault," Sarah whispered. "All of it. The missing cattle, these men showing up, it's all connected to me." "How do you figure?" "Marcus owns people. Judges, cops, private security companies. If he wanted to create a distraction while his investigators searched for me, rustling a few cattle would be nothing to him. Jake considered this, his weathered face grim. That would explain how professional the job was. Most cattle thieves around here are tweakers looking for quick cash, not the kind of people who can cut fences that clean and leave no evidence. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with sickening clarity. Marcus hadn't just sent people to find her, he'd orchestrated an entire operation designed to flush her out. The missing cattle had been bait, ensuring that law enforcement would be stretched thin and distracted while his investigators conducted their search. "I have to run," Sarah said, moving toward the back door. "Before they search this place and find me here, where exactly are you planning to go?" Jake asked, without moving from his position by the window. "They've got vehicles, resources, and a 2-year head start on tracking you. You think you can outrun them on foot in open desert?" The logic was inescapable, but staying felt like accepting defeat. For 2 years, running had been her only defense, the one thing that had kept her alive and free. The idea of stopping, of making a stand, felt foreign and terrifying. "Then what do you suggest? We make them come to us, on our terms, on our ground." The radio crackled again. "They're moving toward the barn. Jake, I need you to circle around behind them while I keep them talking." "Negative," Jake replied immediately. "Sarah's safety is the priority here." There was a pause before Colt's voice came back, tight with controlled anger. "They showed me a picture, Jake. It's definitely her they're looking for." Sarah's knees nearly buckled. Seeing her photograph in those men's hands made everything real in a way that abstract fear never could. They weren't just searching randomly, they had her image, probably her real name, possibly even information about where she'd been and who had helped her along the way. "We need to call Sheriff Martinez," she said desperately. "And tell her what? That some private investigators are asking questions and showing pictures? They're not breaking any laws, Sarah. Not yet." Through the window, she watched as the 2 men split up, the gray-haired one continuing his conversation with Colt while his partner began a casual circuit of the immediate area. Their movements were too coordinated to be random, too purposeful, to be anything other than a systematic search. "There," Jake said quietly, pointing toward the barn. Gray hair just signaled his partner. "They're definitely working together, and they're definitely looking for something specific. Looking for me. Which means we hold the advantage, because we know what they want, and they don't know we know they want it." The logic was sound, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were underestimating their opponents. Marcus hadn't found her by hiring amateurs. These men were professionals, probably with military or law enforcement backgrounds, and they'd been hunting her for longer than Colt and Jake had known she existed. The radio crackled a 3rd time, but this time the voice that came through wasn't Colt's. It was unfamiliar, smooth and cultured with the faint trace of an East Coast accent. "Mr. Morrison, this is Detective Ray Hutchins, formerly with Denver PD. We'd like to have a word with you about harboring a fugitive." Sarah's world went white. Around the edges, "Detective, they weren't just private investigators, they were law enforcement, or at least had been. Which meant they had access to databases, contacts in police departments, and the kind of credibility that could turn local authorities against her." Jake was already moving, checking the loads in his pistol and scanning the area around the bunkhouse with professional efficiency. "Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. These men are not here to arrest you. If they were, they'd have brought local backup and done this by the book. They're here for something else, which means we still have options." "What kind of options?" "The kind that involve trusting Colt to handle the talking while we figure out the best way to handle the action." Through the window, she could see Colt responding to whatever the detective had said, his posture relaxed but alert. Even from this distance, she could read the subtle signals in his body language. He was buying time. keeping them talking while he assessed the situation and planned his next move. "Mr. Morrison," the detective's voice came through the radio again, and Sarah realized he must be broadcasting on an open channel, probably trying to flush her out. "Sarah McKenna is wanted in connection with a serious crime in Denver. Interfering with our investigation would make you an accessory after the fact," Jake snorted. "Wanted in connection with? That's lawyer talk for we don't have enough evidence to charge her with anything specific." "How do you know?" "Because I spent 20 years as a sheriff's deputy before I came to work for Colt. I know the difference between a real warrant and a fishing expedition." The revelation that Jake had law enforcement experience should have been comforting, but Sarah found herself wondering if it made him more likely to turn her over to the authorities. She'd learned the hard way that a badge didn't always mean protection. Sometimes it meant the opposite. If they don't have a warrant, can't Colt just tell them to leave? He can, but that doesn't mean they will. And if they're as connected as you say, they might be able to make life very difficult for him, even if they can't legally force the issue right now. Through the radio, they could hear Colt's measured response. "Detective, I appreciate you identifying yourself, but I'm going to need to see some credentials and a warrant before we continue this conversation. We're not here in an official capacity. Mr. Morrison, we're working for Miss McKenna's family, who are very concerned about her welfare." The lie was so smooth, so plausible, that Sarah almost believed it herself for a moment. Marcus had always been gifted at manipulation, at making his twisted obsession sound like concern and his control sound like protection. How many people had he convinced over the years that she was the problem, that she was unstable or ungrateful or dangerous? "My family's been dead for 3 years, she whispered, more to herself than to Jake. "Then we definitely know these guys are lying." The radio fell silent for a long moment, and Sarah found herself holding her breath as she waited for the next development. Through the window, she could see the 4 men in what appeared to be a Mexican standoff, Colt and the detective facing each other near the main house. While the detective's partner had positioned himself, with a clear view of the surrounding buildings. When Colt's voice finally came through the radio, it was calm but carried an edge that hadn't been there before. "Jake, they're asking for permission to search the property. I'm telling them no, but they're suggesting they might come back with local law enforcement." "Copy that. What's your read on the situation?" "Professional, but not official. They're fishing, and they're getting frustrated." Sarah made a decision that surprised even her. She reached for Jake's radio, and despite his startled protest, keyed the microphone. "Detective Hutchins," she said, her voice carrying across the ranch with crystalline clarity. "This is Sarah McKenna. If you want to talk to me, come alone to the bunkhouse. But understand this, I'm not going anywhere with you, and I'm not answering any questions about Marcus Dalton or what happened in Denver." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, through the open air rather than the radio, she heard the detective's laugh, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. "Ms. McKenna," his voice drifted across the yard, "we just want to help you. Your husband is very worried about you." The word husband hit her like a physical blow. Marcus had never been her husband, despite his claims and threats and the fake documents he'd had created to support his delusions. But hearing someone else use that word, someone in a position of authority, made her feel like the walls were closing in. "He's not my husband," she called back, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "He's my stalker, and if you're working for him, then you're no better than he is." Another silence, longer this time. Then, "I think we need to have this conversation. Face to face, don't you?" Through the window, Sarah watched as the detective began walking toward the bunkhouse, his hands visible but his posture suggesting a man accustomed to getting his way. His partner remained by the SUV, but his attention was focused entirely on the building where she was hiding. "Last chance to run," Jake said quietly. Sarah looked at him, this weathered cowboy who'd spent his afternoon protecting a stranger, who'd revealed his own law enforcement background in an effort to help her understand her options, who was now prepared to face down two dangerous men on her behalf. Then she looked out the window at Colt, still standing guard near the main house, ready to put himself between her and whatever threat these men represented. For the first time in 2 years, she wasn't alone. For the first time since Marcus had destroyed her life in Denver, she had people willing to stand with her instead of against her. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. "No," she said, moving toward the front door. "I'm done running." Sarah stepped onto the bunkhouse porch as Detective Hutchins approached, her heart hammering against her ribs but her feet planted firmly on the weathered wooden planks. Jake positioned himself slightly behind and to her left, his hand resting casually on his sidearm, a detail that didn't escape the detective's notice. Up close, Hutchins looked exactly like what he was, a predator in an expensive suit. His gray hair was perfectly styled despite the desert heat, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his smile carried the cold calculation of a man who'd built a career on breaking people down. But it was his eyes that made Sarah's skin crawl pale. Blue and utterly empty of human warmth. "Ms. McKenna," he said, stopping just outside what most people would consider comfortable conversation distance. "You look well." "Marcus will be pleased to hear that." "Marcus has no right to know anything about how I look or how I am," Sarah replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "And you have no right to be here." Hutchins chuckled, a sound like ice cubes clinking in an empty glass. "Actually, I have every right. You see, there's the matter of the $50,000 you stole from Mr. Dalton's business account before you disappeared." The accusation hit her like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because she could see exactly how Marcus had orchestrated it. He'd probably transferred the money himself, created a paper trail that led back to her, and then reported it stolen. It was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. "I never stole anything from Marcus," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she could hear how weak they sounded. "Bank records say otherwise. Video surveillance from the branch shows someone matching your description, making the withdrawal. Your signature is on the paperwork." Hutchins pulled a manila folder from his jacket and held it up like a weapon. "Shall I continue?" Sarah felt the world tilting around her. She'd known Marcus was capable of many things, but the sophistication of this particular trap caught her off guard. He had 2 years to plan it. 2 years to build a case that would hold up in court and justify whatever methods his people used to bring her back. "Even if that were true," Jake interjected, his voice carrying the authority of his law enforcement background, "it would be a civil matter, not criminal. You'd need a warrant to compel her return to Colorado, and last I checked, you boys weren't carrying any official paperwork." Hutchins turned his attention to Jake for the first time, and Sarah could see him recalibrating his approach as he took in the older man's bearing and obvious competence. "And you are?" "Jake Patterson. I handle security for this ranch." "Former law enforcement?" 20 years with the county sheriff's department before I retired out here." The admission created a subtle shift in the dynamic. Hutchins could no longer dismiss Jake as just another ranch hand. He was dealing with someone who understood the legal system and wouldn't be easily intimidated or deceived. "Then you understand the importance of cooperation in cases like this," Hutchins said smoothly. "Mr. Dalton isn't interested in pressing charges. He just wants his wife back safely." "She's not his wife," Sarah said, the words coming out sharper than she'd intended. "We were never married. He has documents that say otherwise, but they're forgeries. That's not what the records in Denver show. Because he paid someone to create false records. Marcus Dalton is a wealthy man who's used to buying whatever he wants, including people and documents, and probably even ex-cops who don't ask too many questions about where their paychecks come from." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Hutchins' expression didn't change, but Sarah caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested she'd hit closer to the truth than he'd expected. "You're making some serious allegations, Miss McKenna. And you're making some serious threats, Detective," The question is, which one of us is telling the truth? Before Hutchins could respond, Colt's voice cut across the yard from where he'd been watching the detective's partner. "Ray, I think your friend there is getting a little too interested in my barn. Might want to call him back before he accidentally trespasses on posted property." The warning was delivered in a conversational tone, but there was steel underneath it. Through the corner of her eye, Sarah could see the second man had indeed moved closer to the outbuildings, probably hoping to search them while attention was focused on the conversation at the bunkhouse. Hutchins raised his hand in a subtle signal, and his partner immediately stopped his advance. The coordination was smooth and professional, confirming Sarah's suspicion that these men had worked together before and knew how to operate as a team. "Mr. Morrison," Hutchins called back, "we're just trying to resolve the situation peacefully. No one wants any trouble." Funny way of showing it, considering you drove onto my property under false pretenses and are now threatening one of my guests. "We're not threatening anyone. We're simply trying to reunite a concerned husband with his missing wife." The lie was told with such conviction that Sarah almost admired the performance. Marcus had chosen his people well. Hutchins could probably sell snow to Eskimos if the price was right. "For the last time," Sarah said, raising her voice so both men could hear her clearly, "Marcus Dalton is not my husband. He's a man who held me prisoner for 8 months, who threatened to kill me if I ever tried to leave, and who has apparently spent the last 2 years, and God knows how much money trying to drag me back to Denver so he can finish what he started." The words felt like poison leaving her system, toxic truths she'd carried for so long that speaking them aloud felt both liberating and terrifying. She'd never said it all out loud before, never laid out the full scope of Marcus's abuse and obsession for strangers to hear and judge. Hutchins' expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and for just a moment, Sarah thought she saw something that might have been genuine surprise. But it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Those are serious accusations," he said carefully. "If true, they should be reported to the proper authorities. I tried that. Marcus owns half the Denver police force and has dirt on the other half. The one detective who seemed willing to listen transferred to another city 2 weeks after I filed my report, and my case got buried so deep it might as well have never existed." Jake stepped forward slightly, his presence a solid wall of support. At her back. "Seems to me like Ms. McKenna has made her position pretty clear. She doesn't want to go with you, she's not under arrest, and you don't have a warrant. In my experience, that usually means it's time for unwelcome visitors to move along, and if we refuse, then you'll be trespassing, and I'll have to call Sheriff Martinez to come escort you off the property." Hutchins smiled, but there was nothing pleasant about the expression. "Sheriff Martinez is a reasonable woman. I'm sure she'd be very interested to hear about the outstanding warrant for Ms. McKenna's arrest." Sarah felt her knees threaten to buckle. "There's no warrant." "There is now. Issued yesterday afternoon by Judge Harrison Walsh in Denver County. Theft of funds exceeding $50,000, flight to avoid prosecution, and violation of a restraining order." The world went gray around the edges. A restraining order, which meant Marcus had somehow convinced a judge that she was the dangerous one, that she was stalking him instead of the other way around. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking, but Sarah had lived with Marcus long enough to know that audacity was one of his greatest weapons. "Let me see the warrant," Jake demanded. Hutchins reached into his jacket again and produced a folded document. Jake took it and scanned the contents, his weathered face growing darker. With each line he read, "This is bullshit," he said finally. "Judge Walsh is dirty, everyone in Colorado law enforcement knows it, but no one can prove it. He's signed warrants based on fabricated evidence before. Nevertheless, it's a valid legal document. Ms. McKenna will need to come with us to answer the charges. Like hell she will." The new voice belonged to Colt, who had apparently decided the conversation had gone on long enough. He strode across the yard with the purposeful gait of a man who'd reached the end of his patience, his partner trailing behind at a respectful distance. "This is my property," Colt continued as he approached, "and Ms. McKenna is my guest. If you want to arrest her, you can do it through proper channels with local law enforcement and all the appropriate paperwork. Until then, I suggest you get back in your fancy car and head back to whatever rock you crawled out from under." Hutchins' mask finally slipped, revealing the cold fury underneath. "Mr. Morrison, you're interfering with a police investigation. That's a felony." "No, I'm protecting a woman who's clearly terrified of you and your boss. And unless I'm mistaken, you're not actually police anymore, are you, detective? Word is you left Denver PD under something of a cloud." The accusation hit home. Sarah could see it in the way Hutchins' jaw tightened, the way his hands clenched into fists before he forced them to relax. Whatever had ended his police career, it wasn't something he liked being reminded of. "My employment status doesn't change the validity of the warrant." "Maybe not, but it sure as hell changes how seriously I take your authority to serve it." Sarah found herself caught between admiration for Colt's courage and terror at what it might cost him. Marcus didn't tolerate defiance, and he had a long memory for people who crossed him. By standing up to his representatives, Colt was painting a target on his back that might never come off. "You're making a mistake," Hutchins said, his voice dropping to a register that was more threat than warning. "All of you. Mr. Dalton is not a man who accepts disappointment gracefully. And I'm not a man who backs down from bullies, no matter how much money they have or how many people they own." The two men faced each other in the afternoon heat, and Sarah could feel the violence humming in the air between them like electricity. Before a storm, Hutchins was clearly evaluating his options, weighing the satisfaction of immediate action against the complications it would create. Finally, he stepped back, but his eyes never left Colt's face. "This isn't over," he said simply. "No," Colt replied. "I don't expect it is." Hutchins turned to Sarah one last time, and when he spoke, his voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who'd never failed to get what he was paid to retrieve. "You can't run forever, Sarah, and you can't hide behind these people indefinitely. Eventually, you'll have to face the truth about what you did and where you belong." "The only truth," Sarah said, finding strength she didn't know she possessed, "is that I'd rather die than go back to Marcus Dalton." Something flickered in Hutchins' eyes, surprise, perhaps, or maybe even a grudging respect for her defiance. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the cold professionalism that had defined the entire encounter. "We'll be in touch," he said, then turned and walked back toward the SUV where his partner was already waiting behind the wheel. The four of them, Sarah, Colt, Jake, and the detective's partner, watched in silence as Hutchins climbed into the passenger seat. The engine started with a low purr, and the vehicle began its retreat down the ranch road, leaving behind only a cloud of dust and the lingering scent of expensive cologne. It wasn't until the SUV disappeared over the horizon that Sarah realized. She was shaking. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to drop her where she stood. "You did good," Jake said quietly. "Stood your ground, didn't let him rattle you." "I'm terrified," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good," Colt said, moving to stand beside her. "Fear keeps you alive, but so does having people who'll stand with you when the wolves come calling." Sarah looked at him, this man who'd offered her shelter without question, who'd faced down armed investigators on her behalf, who was now looking at her with something that might have been pride. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you risk everything for someone you barely know?" Colt was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes focused on the dust cloud marking Hutchins' retreat. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and hard-won wisdom. "Because 5 years ago, I was the one who needed help. I was the one running from something I couldn't face. And I was lucky enough to find people who were willing to stand between me and the darkness. Sometimes that's all any of us can do, pass along the kindness we were shown when we needed it. Most. What were you running from? That's a story for another day. Right now we need to focus on keeping you safe and figuring out our next move. Jake nodded in agreement. Those boys will be back, probably with more people and better legal cover. We bought ourselves some time, but not much. Then what do we do? Colt looked at her with those steady blue eyes that had seen their share of storms, and somehow found peace on the other side. We make a stand, he said simply. We stop running, stop hiding, and we fight back. Against Marcus? Against his money and connections and army of people like Hutchins? Against whatever comes. Together. The word hung in the air like a promise. And for the first time in 2 years, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. The battle was far from over, but she no longer had to fight it by herself. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah McKenna stood on the porch of a bunkhouse in the middle of nowhere and felt something she'd thought was lost forever: hope. The War Council convened in Colt's kitchen as the sun painted the desert in shades of amber and rust. Sarah sat at the heavy oak table that dominated the room, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Jake occupied the chair across from her, a laptop open in front of him as he ran searches on Detective Hutchins and his partner. Colt moved between the stove and the table, preparing what he insisted would be their last civilized meal before things got complicated. Thomas Reeves, Jake announced, reading from the screen. Hutchins' partner. Former military police, discharged. Under questionable circumstances in 2018. Since then, he's worked private security for several high-profile clients with flexible ethical standards. What kind of questionable circumstances? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Excessive force allegations, evidence tampering, suspected ties to a smuggling operation out of Fort Bragg. Nothing that stuck in court, but enough to end his military career. Colt set a plate of grilled chicken and vegetables in front of her, the simple domesticity of the gesture a stark contrast to the gravity of their situation. Eat, he said simply. You'll need your strength for what's coming. Sarah picked at the food without enthusiasm, her stomach too knotted with anxiety to accommodate much. What exactly is coming? That depends on how patient Marcus is feeling, Jake replied, still typing. If he's smart, he'll wait for Hutchins to establish better legal cover, maybe get Sheriff Martinez on his side, and pressure the county judge to sign extradition papers. Could buy us a few days, and if he's not feeling patient, then they'll come back tonight with more people and fewer scruples about how they handle the situation. The casual way Jake discussed the possibility of violence made Sarah's blood run cold. She'd spent 2 years avoiding exactly this kind of confrontation, and now she was sitting in the middle of it by choice. There's something else, Jake continued, his expression growing darker as he read. Marcus Dalton isn't just wealthy, he's connected to some seriously dangerous people. Import-export business with ties to Eastern European syndicates, political donations that buy silence, business partners who have a habit of disappearing when they become inconvenient. Sarah felt the familiar weight of despair settling over her shoulders. So we're not just fighting Marcus. We're fighting his entire network. We're fighting for what's right, Colt said firmly, settling into the chair beside her. Sometimes that's enough, is it? Really? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like we're 3 people against an army, and the army has all the money and legal backing. Colt studied her face with those penetrating blue eyes, and Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see straight through to the core of her fear, not just of Marcus, but of hope itself. Hope had proven dangerous in the past, a luxury she couldn't afford when survival was the only goal. Tell me about 5 years ago, she said suddenly. What were you running from? Jake looked up from his laptop, clearly as curious as Sarah about this piece of Colt's history. But Colt just shook his head, not in refusal but in something that looked like resigned acceptance. Her name was Elena Rodriguez, he said after a long moment. She was a prosecutor in Tucson, working on a case against a major drug trafficking operation. We'd been together for 2 years, talking about marriage, building a life. Sarah waited, sensing there was more, and that it wouldn't be easy for him to tell. The cartel got to her before she could bring the case to trial. Made it look like a car accident, but everyone knew what it really was. I was a deputy sheriff then, and I wanted justice. Wanted it so badly I was willing to do anything. To get it. What did you do? Things that crossed lines I'd never crossed before. Planted evidence, beat confessions out of suspects, made deals with criminals who promised to help me get to the people responsible for Elena's death. His voice was flat, matter of fact, but Sarah could hear the old pain underneath. Became the kind of cop I'd always despised. Jake had stopped typing, his attention completely focused on Colt's story. This was clearly new information for him as well. Did you get them? Some of them. But in the process, I destroyed everything Elena had worked for. Her case fell apart because of my contaminated evidence. The people she died trying to stop walked free, and I got thrown off the force in disgrace. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Sarah could see herself in Colt's story, the desperate choices, the willingness to sacrifice everything for a chance at something that might not even be possible. So you came here. Ran here, more like. Bought this place with what was left of my savings and tried to disappear into the desert. Spent 3 years drinking too much and feeling sorry for myself before Jake showed up and reminded me that wallowing in guilt doesn't honor the dead. What changed? Colt looked out the window at the vast expanse of his ranch, and when he spoke, there was something different in his voice, something that might have been peace. I realized that Elena didn't die so I could become a bitter, broken man living alone in the middle of nowhere. She died fighting for justice, and if I wanted to honor her memory, I needed to find a way to keep fighting too. Just ... Differently. Sarah felt tears threatening and blinked them back. The parallels between their stories were unmistakable, both of them running from the wreckage of their attempts to fight back against overwhelming odds, both finding refuge in this isolated corner of the world. The difference, Jake said quietly, is that Colt had people who refused to let him stay broken. That's what we're offering you. Before Sarah could respond, the sharp sound of Jake's phone ringing cut through the evening quiet. He glanced at the display and frowned. Sheriff Martinez. He answered on the second ring, his voice carefully neutral. Jake Patterson. Sarah could only hear one side of the conversation, but Jake's increasingly grim expression told her everything she needed to know. When he finally hung up, the silence stretched for several heartbeats. They're back, he said simply. Different vehicles this time, 3 cars, at least 8 people, parked just off county property about 2 miles north. Martinez got a tip from a concerned citizen about suspicious activity and went to check it out. Let me guess, Colt said. Hutchins showed her the warrant and convinced her to cooperate. Worse, they brought a federal marshal with them. Seems Marcus managed to escalate this to the FBI level, claiming Sarah's part of some kind of domestic terrorism cell. The accusation was so absurd that Sarah almost laughed. Domestic terrorism? I'm one woman with a duffel bag and $30 to my name. Doesn't matter if it's true. It matters that it gives them legal cover to do whatever they want. Martinez is driving out here now to serve the warrant personally. Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. Federal marshals, terrorism charges. The weight of the entire legal system turned against her. It was everything she'd feared and more. How long do we have? 20 minutes, maybe 30. Then I run. Right now, out the back into the desert. Maybe I can. No. Colt's voice was firm, brooking no argument. We're done running. Colt, you don't understand. If they take me, they'll make sure I disappear into the system. I'll never see daylight again, and Marcus will have won. And if you run, you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, never able to trust anyone or build anything real. That's not living, Sarah. That's just existing. She wanted to argue, to point out that existing was better than the alternatives Marcus had in mind for her. But looking at Colt's face, at the determination there, the absolute refusal to accept defeat, she found herself wavering. What are you proposing? We make them come to us. Force them to do this. In the open, with witnesses following proper procedures. Make it messy and public and difficult. And then what? They still have their warrant, their federal marshal, their legal authority. Then we trust that the system can still work when good people force it to. Jake looked up from his laptop, where he'd been typing furiously throughout their conversation. I've been in touch with some old contacts, reporters, civil rights lawyers, people who specialize in exposing corruption. If we can get this on record, get media attention, it becomes a lot harder for Marcus to make you disappear quietly. You think that will be enough? I think it's our best shot. Sarah stared out the window at the approaching darkness, weighing her options. She could run. She was good at running, had been doing it successfully for 2 years. But Colt was right about the cost. She was tired of being afraid, tired of being alone, tired of letting Marcus's shadow dictate every choice she made. Okay, she said finally, we make a stand. But I need you both to understand something. Marcus doesn't just destroy his enemies. He destroys everyone around them. Their families, their friends, their livelihoods. Everything they care about becomes a target. Then it's a good thing we don't have much left to lose. Colt replied with a grim smile. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted any response Sarah might have made. Through the kitchen window, she could see headlights cutting through the gathering dusk, not the single patrol car she'd been expecting, but a convoy of official vehicles that spoke of serious federal involvement. Showtime, Jake muttered, closing his laptop and checking his sidearm one last time. They moved to the front porch together, presenting a united front as the convoy pulled up in the yard. Sheriff Martinez emerged from the lead vehicle, her face a mask of professional neutrality that couldn't quite hide her obvious discomfort with the situation. Behind her came a tall man in a federal marshal's uniform, followed by Hutchins and his partner, and finally 4 more men in tactical gear, who moved with the precise coordination of a federal response team. Ms. McKenna, Sheriff Martinez called. As she approached the porch, a folded document in her hand. I have a federal warrant for your arrest. Please step forward and place your hands behind your back. Sarah felt her knees threaten to buckle, but Colt's presence beside her provided an anchor of stability. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading for 2 years, when all her running would finally come to an end. What are the charges? Jake asked, his voice carrying the authority of his law enforcement background. Federal warrant out of Colorado, the marshal replied, stepping forward. Theft of federal funds, wire fraud, flight to avoid prosecution, and conspiracy to commit acts of domestic terrorism. The charges were read in a flat, professional tone that made them sound official and damning. Sarah knew they were fabricated, knew that Marcus had somehow managed to convince federal authorities that she posed a genuine threat. But knowing the truth and proving it were 2 very different things. This is insane, she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. I'm not a terrorist. I'm a victim of domestic violence who had the audacity to escape her abuser. Ma'am, you can address those concerns with your attorney, the marshal replied. Right now I need you to comply with the arrest warrant. Sarah looked at Colt one last time, memorizing the strong lines of his face, the steady blue eyes that had offered her hope when she'd forgotten what it felt like. Then she looked at Jake, this gruff cowboy who'd spent his afternoon trying to protect a stranger from forces beyond his control. Thank you, she said simply. Both of you, for everything. But as she started to step forward, Colt's hand landed gently on her arm. Wait, he said, his voice carrying across the yard with quiet authority. "Marshal, before you take her, there's something you should know about the man who filed these charges." The marshal paused, clearly reluctant to delay the arrest but professionally obligated to listen. "What kind of information?" "The kind that suggests Marcus Dalton isn't the concerned husband he's pretending to be. The kind that might make you wonder why a man would spend 2 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars hunting down one woman, if his intentions were really as innocent as he claims." Sarah felt a flicker of hope as she realized what Colt was doing. He was buying time, forcing the situation into the open, making it impossible for them to simply disappear her into the system without questions being asked. "Mr. Morrison," Sheriff Martinez said wearily, "this is a federal matter now. Local concerns don't. Local concerns about falsified evidence, corrupted judges, and a pattern of stalking behavior that crosses state lines." Jake interrupted, stepping forward with his own folded documents. "Because I've got 20 years of law enforcement experience and a file full of evidence that suggests Sarah McKenna isn't the criminal here." The marshal looked between them, clearly calculating the cost of proceeding with the arrest against the potential complications of ignoring credible allegations of misconduct. It was a moment balanced on a knife's edge, and Sarah held her breath as she waited to see which way it would fall. "You have 5 minutes, the marshal said finally. "But Ms. McKenna remains in custody during any discussion." It wasn't the victory Sarah had hoped for, but it was something. As the marshal moved forward with handcuffs, she caught Colt's eye one last time. "Don't let him win," she whispered. "Not a chance in hell," he replied. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't fighting alone anymore. The handcuffs felt heavier than Sarah had expected, the metal cold against her wrists as she stood between 2 federal agents on Colt's front porch. The marshal had positioned her where she could hear the conversation, but couldn't interfere. A strategic reminder that her fate was now in other people's hands. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of another storm on the horizon. Jake had spread his documents across the porch railing like a prosecutor laying out evidence, each paper weighted down against the wind with smooth river stones from Colt's garden. The marshal stood with his arms crossed, his expression skeptical but professional, while Sheriff Martinez hovered nearby with the uncomfortable air of someone caught between competing authorities. "This is Marcus Dalton's financial records for the past 3 years, Jake began, pointing to the first set of documents. "Notice the pattern of payments to private investigation firms, security companies, and what appear to be shell corporations designed to hide money trails. Where did you get these?" the marshal asked, his tone suggesting that the source might determine how seriously he took the information. "Legal discovery from a civil suit filed by one of Dalton's former business partners. Public record, available to anyone who knows where to look." Colt moved closer to Sarah, not touching but close enough that she could feel his solid presence, like an anchor in the chaos. "Tell them about Dr. Amanda Chun," he said quietly. Jake nodded and pulled out another document. Dr. Chun was Sarah's physician in Denver. She documented extensive injuries consistent with domestic abuse, broken ribs, a fractured wrist, psychological trauma. Her medical records show a clear pattern of escalating violence over an 8-month period. "Medical records are confidential," Detective Hutchins interjected from where he stood with his partner near the federal vehicles. "You can't have obtained those legally. Dr. Chun provided them voluntarily when she learned about the terrorism charges," Jake replied smoothly. "Turns out she's been worried about Sarah's safety for 2 years, and was relieved to finally have someone asking the right questions." Sarah felt tears threatening as she realized the scope of what Jake and Colt had accomplished in just a few hours. They'd reached out to people she'd thought were lost to her forever, built a network of support she never knew existed, gathered evidence she'd been too afraid to collect herself. The marshal examined the medical records with growing interest, his professional skepticism warring with the weight of documented evidence. "This doesn't change the federal charges," he said finally. "Whatever happened between Miss McKenna and Mr. Dalton in their personal relationship doesn't negate the theft and terrorism allegations." "It does if those allegations are fabricated," Colt said, stepping forward with his own folder. "Marshal, meet Judge Harrison Walsh, the same judge who signed the warrant for Sarah's arrest." He spread out a series of photographs that made Sheriff Martinez gasp audibly. They showed Judge Walsh at what appeared to be a private party, shaking hands with Marcus Dalton, accepting an envelope that was clearly thick with cash, raising a toast with several men Sarah recognized as Marcus's business associates. "These were taken 6 months ago at a private fundraiser," Colt continued. "Turns out Judge Walsh has been taking money from Marcus Dalton for years, in exchange for favorable rulings in civil cases and expedited processing of criminal complaints." The marshal's expression had shifted from skepticism to serious concern. "How did you obtain these photographs?" "A private investigator named Rebecca Torres. She's been building a case against judicial corruption in Denver for the past 2 years, and Marcus Dalton is at the center of it. She's been waiting for the right moment to go public, and that moment is now." Jake smiled grimly. "She's already contacted the Denver Post, the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, and the Colorado Attorney General's office. By tomorrow morning, Judge Walsh's connection to Marcus Dalton will be front-page news." Sarah watched the marshal processing. This information saw the moment when his certainty about the charges began to crack. But it was Hutchins who broke the silence, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "This is all very interesting, but it doesn't change the fact that Sarah McKenna stole $50,000 from Marcus Dalton's business account. We have video evidence, bank records, her signature on the withdrawal slips." "Do you?" Colt asked mildly. "Because Rebecca Torres also obtained the original security footage from that bank. Turns out the woman in the video isn't Sarah at all. It's a professional actress named Diana Walsh, Judge Walsh's niece, who bears a remarkable resemblance to Sarah and was paid handsomely to impersonate her." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Sarah stared at Colt in amazement, realizing that he and Jake had unraveled Marcus's entire fabricated case in the space of a single afternoon. But more than that, they'd exposed a conspiracy that reached far beyond her individual situation. Sheriff Martinez stepped forward, her hand resting on her service weapon. "Detective Hutchins, I think we need to have a conversation about the validity of these charges." "The charges are valid," Hutchins replied, but Sarah could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Judge Walsh signed the warrant based on evidence provided by my client. Evidence we now know is fabricated," the marshal said flatly. "Detective, I'm going to need you and your partner to remain available for questioning while we sort this out." "You can't be serious. We're private investigators working a legitimate case for a concerned husband. A concerned husband who has apparently spent 2 years orchestrating an elaborate frame job against his ex-girlfriend, using corrupted officials and falsified evidence." The marshal turned to Sarah, and for the first time, his expression held something that might have been sympathy. "Ms. McKenna, I'm going to need you to make a full statement about your relationship with Marcus Dalton and the circumstances that led to your departure from Denver." Sarah felt a surge of hope so intense it was almost painful. "You believe me?" "I believe the evidence. And right now, the evidence suggests you're a victim, not a perpetrator." The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted the conversation. This time it wasn't official cars, but a dusty pickup truck followed by a van with television station logos on the side. Rebecca Torres climbed out of the pickup, a woman in her 40s with graying hair and the sharp eyes of someone who'd made a career of uncovering uncomfortable truths. "Sorry I'm late," she called as she approached the group, a thick briefcase in one hand and a recording device in the other. "Had to make a quick stop at the courthouse to file some additional evidence." Behind her, a news crew was setting up cameras and lighting equipment with practiced efficiency. Sarah realized that Jake and Colt hadn't just gathered evidence. They'd orchestrated a public exposure that would make it impossible for Marcus to bury the truth again. "Miss Torres," the marshal said with obvious relief. "Marshal Davidson, FBI. I understand you have additional information about this case." "I have enough information to put Marcus Dalton and Judge Walsh in federal prison for the next 20 years, Rebecca replied, opening her briefcase to reveal what looked like hundreds of documents, photographs, and recordings. Conspiracy, bribery, obstruction of justice, stalking, witness intimidation. The man's been running a criminal enterprise, masquerading as a business empire. Detective Hutchins had gone pale, clearly recognizing that his lucrative employment was about to become a liability. His partner was already backing toward their SUV, probably calculating whether he could reach the vehicle before anyone decided. "To detain him, Detective," Sheriff Martinez called sharply. "Don't even think about it." The marshal removed the handcuffs from Sarah's wrists with an apologetic expression. "Ms. McKenna, you're free to go. I'll need that statement when you're ready, but right now, I think we have bigger fish to catch." Sarah rubbed her wrists, still unable to believe that the nightmare was actually ending. 2 years of running, 2 years of fear and isolation and desperation. And it was ending here in the middle of a New Mexico ranch with the desert wind carrying the scent of justice on the evening air. "How?" she asked, looking between Colt and Jake. "How did you do all this in one afternoon?" "We didn't," Jake replied with a grin. "Rebecca's been building this case for 2 years, ever since Marcus's last victim contacted her. We just gave her the final piece she needed, your testimony and the medical records from Dr. Chun." "His last victim?" Rebecca Torres stepped forward, her expression gentle but determined. "You weren't the first woman Marcus targeted, Sarah. There were 3 others before you, each one isolated and terrorized, until they either submitted completely or disappeared altogether. You were the first one brave enough to run, and the first one brave enough to survive long enough for us to find you." The revelation that she wasn't alone, that there were other women who'd suffered under Marcus's obsession, hit Sarah with unexpected force. She thought of all the nights she'd wondered if she was crazy, if she'd somehow brought his abuse on herself, if she was the only person in the world who'd seen past his charming public facade to the monster underneath. Where are they now? The other women? Rebecca's expression darkened. One died in what was ruled a suicide, but looked suspiciously like murder. Another disappeared completely, no trace, no trail, just gone. The third, Elena Vasquez, is the one who contacted me. She's been in witness protection for the past year, waiting for enough evidence to come forward safely. The name Elena sent a chill through Sarah, not because she recognized it, but because she didn't. How many women had Marcus destroyed before he'd set his sights on her? How many lives had been shattered while he perfected his methods of control and intimidation? "He needs to pay," she said quietly. "Not just for what he did to me, but for all of them." "He will," the marshal assured her. "With the evidence Ms. Torres has compiled, plus your testimony and the proof of judicial corruption, Marcus Dalton is looking at multiple federal charges. He won't be in a position to hurt anyone ever again." As if summoned by the mention of his name, another vehicle appeared on the horizon, a sleek, black limousine that moved across the desert landscape like a shark cutting through water. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized the distinctive vehicle. Marcus had come himself. "That's him," she whispered, and every eye turned toward the approaching car. Colt moved instinctively to place himself between Sarah and the limousine, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. Jake flanked her other side, while the marshal and his team took positions that would allow them to control the situation if it turned violent. The limousine pulled to a stop at the edge of the yard, its engine purring like a contented predator. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the rear door opened, and Marcus Dalton stepped out into the New Mexico desert like a king surveying his domain. He was exactly as Sarah remembered, tall, impeccably dressed, radiating the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of getting exactly what he wanted. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the desert wind. His suit probably cost more than most people made in a month, and his smile held all the warmth of a winter grave. "Sarah," he called across the yard, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "You've led me quite a chase, darling. I think it's time to come home." The casual arrogance of the statement, the complete disregard for the federal agents and evidence of his crimes, sent rage coursing through Sarah's veins. For 2 years, she'd been afraid of this man, terrified of his reach and his resources and his willingness to destroy anyone who crossed him. But standing here now, surrounded by people who'd risked everything to protect her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the absence of fear. "I am home," she replied, her voice carrying across the distance between them with perfect clarity. "And you're under arrest." Marcus's smile never wavered, but something cold and dangerous flickered in his eyes. "I don't think so, darling. You see, I own half the law enforcement in this state, and the other half knows better than to cross me. This little performance might be entertaining, but it changes nothing." "Actually," Marshal Davidson said, stepping forward with his badge clearly visible, "it changes everything. Marcus Dalton, you're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, obstruction of justice, and violation of federal stalking statutes." For the first time since Sarah had known him, Marcus Dalton looked genuinely surprised. But the expression was gone so quickly she might have imagined it, replaced by the cold calculation of a man who'd built an empire on the assumption that everyone had a price. "Marshal," he said smoothly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm here to collect my wife, who has been suffering from a mental breakdown and needs medical attention." "She's not your wife," Colt said, his voice carrying the finality of a closing door. "She never was. And the only person here who needs medical attention is you specifically, a psychiatric evaluation to determine your fitness to stand trial." Marcus's gaze shifted to Colt for the first time, and Sarah saw the exact moment when he decided that this cowboy represented a threat that needed to be eliminated. It was a look she'd seen before, usually right before someone who'd crossed Marcus. "Suffered an unfortunate accident, and you are? The man who's going to make sure you never hurt her again." The confrontation that had been building for 2 years was finally here, and Sarah found herself standing at the center of it with the wind at her back and justice on her side. Whatever happened next, she wasn't facing it alone anymore. Marcus Dalton had met his match in the desert, and for the first time in her life, Sarah McKenna was ready to watch him fall. The desert had fallen silent except for the whisper of wind through the sage and the distant rumble of thunder from the approaching storm. Marcus stood 20 feet away, his expensive suit incongruous against the rugged landscape, his carefully maintained facade beginning to crack as the reality of his situation settled in. The federal agents had their hands on their weapons, the news cameras were rolling, and 2 years of carefully orchestrated lies were crumbling around him like a house of cards. "You have no idea what you've done," Marcus said, his voice still controlled but edged with something Sarah had never heard before: genuine fear. "The people I work with don't accept failure gracefully. If I go down, a lot of innocent people are going to suffer." "The only innocent person here is Sarah," Colt replied, taking a step forward, "and she suffered enough." Marcus's gaze shifted. Between the assembled faces, the federal marshal with his hand on his weapon, Rebecca Torres with her briefcase full of evidence, the news crew documenting everything for the world to see. But it was Sarah he focused on, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same hypnotic quality that had once made her believe his lies. "Sarah, darling, look at what you've become. Hiding behind these people, turning yourself into a victim when you know the truth. We had something beautiful together, something real, and you threw it away because you were too weak to handle real love." The words hit their target, awakening the old doubts and fears that had plagued Sarah for 2 years. Part of her, the part that had been broken and rebuilt in Marcus's image, whispered that Maybe he was right. Maybe she was weak. Maybe she had thrown away something precious. Maybe she didn't deserve the protection these good people were offering. "I'm not worth saving," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The admission hung in the air like a confession, and she saw Marcus's smile widen in triumph. It was then that Colt turned to her, his blue eyes steady and kind, and spoke the words that would change everything. "Good thing I'm not a saint." The simple statement cut through Marcus's manipulation like a blade through silk. Sarah found herself looking at this weathered cowboy who'd risked everything for a stranger, who'd faced down federal agents and private investigators and corrupt officials, who'd gathered an army of allies to fight for someone he barely knew. "Saints save people because it's their duty," Colt continued, his voice gentle but unwavering. "I'm helping you because I choose to. Because you're worth choosing, worth fighting for, worth standing beside when the storms come. That's not about being good enough or worthy enough, it's about being human." The words shattered something inside Sarah that had been carefully constructed by years of abuse and manipulation. She wasn't a victim to be saved or a prize to be won. She was a person deserving of choice, of agency, of the simple human dignity that Marcus had spent so long trying to steal from her. "You're right," she said, turning to face Marcus directly. "For the first time, I'm not worth saving. But I am worth fighting for, worth standing up for, worth choosing. And these people chose me, just like I'm choosing them." Marcus's facade finally cracked completely, revealing the rage and desperation underneath. "You ungrateful bitch. After everything I did for you, everything I gave you, you gave me nothing but fear and pain." Sarah cut him off, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "You took a woman who loved you and tried to break her into something you could own. But you failed, Marcus. I'm still here, still whole, still capable of being loved by people who don't need to destroy me to feel powerful." The federal marshal stepped forward, reading Miranda rights from a card with practiced efficiency. But Marcus wasn't listening. His attention was fixed entirely on Sarah, his expression cycling through disbelief, rage, and something that might have been genuine anguish. "This isn't over," he said as the handcuffs clicked into place. "You think these people care about you? You think they'll stick around when things get difficult? You'll be alone again, Sarah. You always end up alone." "Maybe," Sarah replied with a calmness that surprised even her. "But that's my choice to make, not yours. And if I am alone, it'll be because I chose solitude over slavery." As the federal agents led Marcus toward their vehicles, Detective Hutchins made one last desperate play for freedom. He broke away from Sheriff Martinez and sprinted toward his SUV, but Jake was ready for him. The old cowboy moved with surprising speed, tackling the fleeing detective and bringing him down hard in the dust. 20 years of law enforcement," Jake said as he zip-tied Hutchins' hands behind his back. "You learned to spot the runners." The news crew captured it all: the arrest, the confrontation, Sarah's declaration of independence from the man who'd terrorized her for 2 years. Tomorrow the story would be everywhere: the corrupt judge, the falsified evidence, the network of intimidation and bribery that Marcus had built around his obsession. But tonight, as the last of the federal vehicles disappeared into the desert, darkness, it was just the three of them again, Sarah, Colt, and Jake, standing on the porch of a ranch house under a sky full of stars. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, suddenly uncertain. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the reality that she was free, but had no idea what freedom actually meant after so many years of running. "Now you decide what kind of life you want to build," Colt said simply. "Take your time figuring it out. The bunkhouse is yours as long as you need it. I don't have any money, any skills that translate to legitimate work, any real idea how to be a normal person." "Neither did I when I got here," Colt replied with a smile. "Ranch work is good for learning how to be human again. Horses don't care about your past, they only care about who you are right now." Sarah looked out over the vast expanse of desert. At the mountains silhouetted against the star-drunk sky, at the peaceful kingdom these two men had built in the middle of nowhere. For the first time in years, the future felt like something other than a threat. "I'd like that," she said quietly. "I'd like to learn how to be human again." 3 months later, Sarah McKenna sat on the same porch where she'd once faced down her demons, watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of gold and amber. Her hands were calloused now from ranch work, her skin bronzed by the desert sun, her body strong from days spent in the saddle and nights spent sleeping without fear. Marcus Dalton was in federal prison, awaiting trial on 43 separate charges. Judge Walsh had been disbarred and faced his own criminal proceedings. Detective Hutchins had plea bargained his way into a 10-year sentence in exchange for testimony against his former associates. But more importantly, Sarah had learned what Colt meant about choosing people instead of saving them. She'd chosen this place, these friends, this life that she was building one day at a time. And every morning when she woke up in the bunkhouse, which Colt had quietly transferred into her name, she made the choice again. "Coffee's ready, Colt," called from the kitchen, the same words that had become ritual between them. "I'll be right there," she called back, but she stayed on the porch for another moment, breathing in the clean desert air and marveling at the simple miracle of being alive and free and chosen. The cowboy had been right, he wasn't a saint. Saints saved people out of duty and obligation. But Colt Morrison was something better. He was a man who chose to stand beside someone when they needed standing beside, who offered shelter not because it was required, but because it was right. And Sarah McKenna, no longer running, no longer hiding, no longer afraid, had finally learned the difference between being saved and being chosen. In the end, she discovered being chosen was infinitely more valuable. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and new possibilities. And for the first time in her life, Sarah smiled without reservation and meant it completely. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from U.S.